The questions you're asking me are very specific. Number one, the role of the private sector. Number two, I think you want to ask for the projects and reforms that need to be fast-tracked.
Yes.
Of course, some examples. Well, it is my firm belief that the private sector is actually ahead of the government, private and public sectors when it comes to regional integration. Because in the private sector, when you listen to or talk to somebody like Bill, as an individual, he is integrated. He's worked across Africa. As an individual, James, you are integrated. The panelists are all integrated. I've worked in Cameroon, worked in Gambia, Uganda, Kenya, Zimbabwe, Cote d'Ivoire, Ghana, etc. So the role I play here is to ensure that I make a strong business case for regional integration when I have conversations with various stakeholders. And introduce stakeholders to meet with each other, have meaningful conversations. It'll be important to look at the quality and frequency of those conversations. And beyond conversations to the actions they really take. So we can be the catalyst to get these guys there, because many a times we know the markets. We've been doing business in those markets for many years. A lot of respect for my colleagues who are in the public sector. Many of them are domestically focused, and with reason. We've dealt with the challenges of traveling across those regions. So it's important that over and beyond what we as bankers would consider as a core responsibility to mobilize resources, we become the strong advocates for integration across the continent. Now, when you talk of resources, it's interesting to note that Africa needs approximately $93 billion per annum to work on infrastructure alone to ensure this integration. And African countries are currently providing, based on 2009 statistics, $53.2 billion. So there's a net deficit of $40 billion required. Again, the private sector will help mobilize these resources. And to do this, I think there are some basic, as you said, reforms and projects that probably need to be fast-tracked. We need to fast-track. Now, when you introduced me, you talked about Standard Chartered stability in trade. So my focus would be more on trade-enabling infrastructure projects. They're very basic. They've been mentioned by most of our colleagues here. They will include roads, rail, ports, airports, for God's sake. I mean, if you can't fly to a country, you will not know the potential that's really available within that country. And across Africa, you need investments in runways, in taxiways, in cargo and passenger terminal capacity, air traffic controls, and communication equipment. Approximately 800 million per annum is required, small in context if you look at the 93 billion required per annum. But this is very important, and we need to address this immediately. ICT, a very important area of focus. A lot has been said about it already, and I believe a lot is being done to improve on this, so I don't need to touch on that. Now, an example of roads, for instance. A lot has been said about Eastern and Southern Africa, but if you look at the CEMAC zone, which is in West Africa, there has been this CEMAC, corridor, road corridor, which enables goods to move from Cameroon to Chad and the Central African Republic. Now, this region is the most expensive in transporting goods from one country to another. Indeed, what has been stated is that between Cameroon and I think it's Chad. In Cameroon, is approximately 53% of the overall cost of exports. And in Cameroon, transportation cost approximately 33% of the overall cost of exports. So these are projects that we need to look at, and they need to be fast-tracked. And in this case, this project is approximately 260 billion, and you got AFDB, the World Bank, European Community coming to a partnership to get this delivered. So that's working well, but they worked well with the countries also, and within the framework of CEMAC, which already it is an economic and monetary union in Central Africa. On reforms, I think property registration is very important. Bilateral treaties, which we've talked about, are increasingly more important today than ever before. And a lot of talk here. It's been a talk shop. It's important we start implementing some of this. We have public sector reforms. I'm afraid civil servants at some point must see themselves as service providers to their to various stakeholders in their countries, and that reforms in those areas cannot be underestimated. Harmonization of financial services regulations, very important. But I think one of the most important ones for regional integration is macroeconomic convergence, which increasingly I think we are addressing, and the speakers before me did touch on this briefly. And finally, legal reforms. In legal reforms, you have OHADA legal reforms, which has been very important. And the lawyers say we know that OHADA, what OHADA is doing is setting up a uniform and harmonized system of business law implementation already done in 16 states, and all the African states are doing their best to ensure that this is applied in their various areas of interest. Now, some of the projects, I talked of one already, and another area which we need to really focus on in terms of reform agenda is to ensure that we finally, and when I say finally, it's been talked about and we all believe in it, but we failed to really institutionalize the imperatives to ensure that PPPs become successful across Africa. But there are success stories. For instance, we have a case where you had a BOT project, and the BOT project was actually in Zambia, between Zambia and Botswana, is the Kanzugula rail and road bridge, which linked Botswana and Zambia. It's a BOT that is working, that's going to work very well, and I think it's credit to the various stakeholders there. Another one would be the Mavingi and Chikamba project, which is an energy project in Mozambique. And what it did is the private sector sourced the financing, they did build the facility, and they're selling power to the national grids of countries south of Mozambique and also into South Africa. So these are some of the projects that have worked very well because of reform agendas and commitment of various parties. But again, they were led by the private sector.
Doing business in Africa, you can't afford to be without Africa Investor.